Welcome to the Emergency Management and Preparedness Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities webinar series. I'm Lewis Krause from the Pacific ADA Center, your moderator for this series. This series of webinars is brought to you by the Pacific ADA Center on behalf of the ADA National Network. The ADA National Network is made up of 10 regional centers that are federally funded to provide training, technical assistance, and other information as needed on the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can reach your regional ADA center by dialing 1-800-949-4232. As always, real-time captioning is provided for this webinar. The caption screen can be accessed by choosing the CC icon in the meeting control toolbar shown on the screen. To toggle that meeting control toolbar permanently on, press the Alt key and press it again if you need to. You can also move the caption box wherever you would like on your screen by just clicking and dragging. As always in our sessions, only the speakers will have audio. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer, prefer to listen by phone, you can dial 1-669-900-9128 or 1-646-558-8656 and use the webinar ID 845-3662-6656. I want to note for you all again that this webinar is being recorded and can be accessed at the adapresentations.org website in the archive section of emergency management area next week. This is the 8th year of this webinar series, which shares issues and promising practices in emergency management, inclusive of people with disabilities and others with access and functional needs. The series topics cover emergency preparedness and disaster response, recovery and mitigation, as well as accessibility and reasonable accommodation issues under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA, and other relevant laws. Upcoming sessions are available at adapresentations.org under the Schedule tab in the Emergency Management section. These monthly webinars occur on the second Thursday of the month at 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central, 12:30 Mountain, and 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. By being here, you are on the list to receive notices for future webinars in the series. The notices go out 2 weeks before the next webinar and open that webinar to registration. You can follow along on the webinar platform with the slides. If you would like to download a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation, you can at the adapresentations.org webpage in the Schedule section of Emergency Management. At the conclusion of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions. You may submit your questions using the chat area within the webinar platform. The speakers and I will address them at the end of the session, so feel free to submit them as they come to your mind during the presentation. To submit questions, you open the chat area text box and enter it. Or if you are using keystrokes, use the keys Alt and H together and enter your text in the chat area. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the webinar, you can ask the questions by emailing them to adatech@adapacific.org. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, send a private chat message to the host by typing in the chat window. You can also email us at adatech@adapacific.org. That's adatech@adapacific.org. Or call us at 510-285-5600. Today's ADA National Network learning session is titled The Realities of Emergency Management, understanding our realities and how they impact inclusive emergency management. Emergency management directors deal with some surprising and sometimes immovable obstacles, I should say, in their operations, including tiny budgets, small to no staff, and a lack of political concern or support. To be successful as an emergency management director, or when working with emergency management directors to improve the accessibility and the ADA compliance of an emergency management program, it's important to understand these realities. This webinar will discuss not only the realities our emergency managers face, but how to incorporate these realities in approaches to increasing accessibility and ADA compliance in emergency management. Today's speakers are Dawn Brantley. Dawn is the acting director of the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency and the founder of the Inclusive Emergency Management Community. She's also an attorney and founder and VP of the International Association of Mass Care Professionals and co-chair of NEMA's Diversity and Equity Committee. She has spent more than 14 years in emergency management at the local, regional, state, and federal levels, and has responded to 24 disasters in 6 states. Stephen Lerner currently serves as a senior planner with Seminole County, Florida's emergency management. During his 10-year career with Seminole County, Stephen worked in mitigation, recovery, planning, and response, including work in inclusive emergency management. Mr. Lerner has responded to numerous disasters in Florida and is a national leading expert in the areas of response and mass care. So I will now turn it over to you, Dawn and Stephen, who are on camera, by the way, for those of you who are seeing that.
Hey, thank you, Louis. Good afternoon. Yes, Stephen and I opted to be on camera like we would in a real world presentation. So what a treat. Just kidding. So welcome to the Realities of Emergency Management. And a huge thanks to Louis, who this was actually intended to be a training webinar for our inclusive EM community, which we'll share some information about later. When I reached out to actually invite Louis to be a part of it, he said, well, hey, why don't you join us on May 12th and do it for a much broader audience, which we couldn't resist. So that's how you guys get to hear from myself and my fantastic, amazing colleague, Stephen. Next slide. Perfect. This is an outline of how we're going to go through today. To build on what Louis introed for this webinar, we really feel like this knowledge and its application to our work is absolutely critical. It increases our chances of successfully getting buy-in from emergency management directors, whether it's state, local, or federal level or private sector. It increases our success at persuading change and increasing inclusivity at all levels. When we ask an emergency management director, and you'll hear us say EMD, and that's what we mean as an emergency management director. So when we ask them for something that they cannot give, then that goal cannot be reached. And EMDs may end discussions or reduce their cooperation when you continue to ask them for things that just aren't possible. When we acknowledge their realities, the obstacles that they face, and we demonstrably make an effort to adapt or incorporate them into our asks, then the EMD feels understood, less criticized, and is more willing to listen and to work collaboratively. So today we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of laying out the roles and responsibilities of local and state EM. So it just establishes a baseline because we have a wide variety of participants today. And then we're going to delve into the realities. And we're going to talk through exactly what those are going to be. And then finally, we're going to end on adapting our approach. But Stephen and I also wanted to start by saying, as we walk through the realities that we're going to share with you today for state and local EM, this is not an attempt to make an excuse for why we don't or we haven't or won't make a program more accessible. It's about giving you the facts that these are the obstacles that we face. And we are always going to talk also about how do you adapt your approach? How do you use that knowledge to be more successful in making your programs inclusive if they're yours, or if you're talking to an EMD, how do you use that knowledge to then approach them and be more successful in what you do? Next slide. So before we delve into the realities, it's important to understand that there's a division of responsibilities for response operations for steady state, which is what you might call it blue sky, steady state. This is day to day. What do we do for planning, preparedness, mitigation, et cetera? At the local level, and Stephen, please jump in whenever you like, those are your boots on the ground, community level emergency management directors. They are the beginning, middle, and end of any response and recovery. Stephen, am I portraying that fairly well? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, so it's really the responsibility of the local emergency manager to really have that in-depth understanding of not only the population that they serve day to day, but even the individuals that may come to their community during a disaster. So for example, in Florida, I'm one of the lucky communities that is not coastal. However, the coastal communities, when we evacuate for a hurricane or a large wildfire, we have to be prepared as an inland community to host a lot of those individuals and be intimately aware of our partners and their capabilities in their community so that we can serve their residents as well.
Yeah, that's great. At the state level, it's a little bit different. I'm going to talk more later about the dual mission of a state emergency management agency. At the local level, where you have primarily generalists in emergency management, they do all the pieces of that puzzle. At the state level, you'll have some generalists, but people are more specialized and provide support in a bunch of different ways. So we're going to look a little bit at the variations in budgets and workload and staffing, but it's important to really understand that boots on the ground work, 99% of it happens at the local level. And then the next layer of support is state. The layer above that is FEMA. Sometimes we call them the checkbook because they come in and do all of the reimbursement, but they do have a bigger role as well. When we're talking about realities today, we're going to be focusing on really 4 areas: staffing and workload, leadership and political will, control and accountability, and funding. Next slide. No matter what we're talking about, or no matter what phase of emergency management we're discussing, whether it's planning, mitigation, response, recovery, everything that comes before response is really to support response and recovery. When we do plans, it's because we want them to be implemented for response and recovery. When we do mitigation, we're doing mitigation to reduce the risk, eliminate it if possible, reduce the damages. When we're doing public outreach and public information, it's really about helping other people prepare or be aware so that during response and recovery, they're better off and they're safer. So literally everything that we do in emergency management is in support of this primary mission of response and recovery. Stephen, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and you know, it's so important in emergency management when we go through this process of preparing for response. Response is such a small component of our everyday, career-wide duties. We spend about 95% of our jobs day to day in that preparedness, mitigation, and recovery component. And a lot of that is geared around a lot of different data sets that we have on identifying some of those vulnerable populations in our communities, to making sure that they have the right information to make those right decisions when a disaster does happen, and that our locations and disaster sites that we may set up to provide assistance to the community is as accessible as possible within our budgets and our confined strengths that we may have to serve our community.
Next slide. All right, so first up, staffing and workload. In Massachusetts, in the fall, we released the results of a statewide emergency management needs assessment. So some of the MEMA team who are on might be pretty familiar with that work. One of the things that stood out to me is, as well, one of the most shocking things that came out of that for me was that the average full-time emergency management staff at the local level was 0. So let me just say that again. At the local level, the average full-time EM staff is 0. So as you're listening, as Stephen talks next about staffing and workload at the local level, and then I talk about it at the state, try to picture what that means when you come up to an emergency management director with it, and the only thing that you do is ask them for more. So again, not making excuses, just telling you that this is the fact that you need to adapt to. And whether it's an impossibility or an opportunity, we're going to talk through a little bit later on. Next slide.
So on the local emergency management side, especially in Florida now, many of you know, Florida is historically a hotbed for disasters, in that it's either a notable trial that happens, or a hurricane, or a wildfire, or some people say Florida man is our disaster across the community. Everybody has done that. What's important to note is that the capabilities of a local emergency management team. When Dawn mentioned that the average FTE in her state is 0 for an emergency management office, in Florida, we're governed under a statute called 252, which states that every county, all 67 counties in Florida, must have an emergency manager. Unfortunately, what that has turned into is that may not be a full-time emergency manager. We have emergency managers in Florida who also have duties to be a mosquito control director. So while they are building plans and procedures and setting up shelters and figuring out ways to feed communities and responding to incidents of widespread power outage, and making sure that the utilities are still flowing, they're also spraying for mosquitoes. And while that may seem something that is a little challenging, it is in those communities in order to dedicate the proper amount of focus towards those in emergency management. In Florida and across the country, what we've seen historically is those who fill the emergency management role locally may be somebody who have come up through a first response profession, like those who have been a firefighter or a law enforcement officer or an EMT, somebody with a first response background. It's only within the last 10 years that we've seen individuals like myself who have come into the field through degree programs that are actually looking through emergency management in this wider and broader context of just first response. We're looking at emergency management in the human services capacity and figuring out some of the more innovative and best ways to serve those individuals. That's not to discount the individuals that are public service, public safety professionals that fill that role of emergency management, because it's important that we glean on their experience and learn from the lessons that they have learned throughout the years, and figuring out what ways that we can, as emergency management professionals, better serve our communities. In terms of workload, as many people are aware, the disasters are only becoming more frequent and they're becoming stronger. Last hurricane season, not only did we burn through all of the normal named storms, but we went through the Greek alphabet. It was the first time where we saw historic storm levels in the Atlantic. This workload has put emergency management staff in something called the constant disaster cycle. And we're working to figure out how we manage expectations for the community when we're constantly in this response mode. It becomes incredibly challenging for us to adequately plan and adequately develop mitigation and planning techniques to best serve all of the individuals in our communities when we're constantly in that response mode with limited FTEs and limited budget. Dawn, do you want me to talk about budget in here as well?
No, we'll do that in just a little bit, but just to add to what Stephen was describing, you know, when, and I'm going to say a percentage, but it's just anecdotal. I haven't done the research or read research on this, but my anecdotal estimate would be easily over 80% of local emergency management staff are, and directors in particular, are embedded within fire. And frequently this is done to save money. So if you don't have to pay someone an additional FTE salary, if you don't have to, then as a city or a town, you don't. And we have lots of fire chiefs who do an amazing job in emergency management. But when you look at their day-to-day workload and you have fires going all the time that you have to respond to, you've got your fire duties as fire chief, managing the fire department, they just might not have as much time as a full-time EMD or even a part-time EMD to be able to focus on emergency management. It is a tertiary duty for them. And then the day-to-day workload for emergency managers, as Stephen said, has just increased. Every day, these folks are trying to balance their fire chief or deputy fire chief duties or police chief duties, or they're coming in as volunteers or part-time, and they have to do their emergency operations plan or their comprehensive emergency management plan. They've got to deal with their mitigation plan, recovery planning, grant management, mitigation project management, all of their equipment and their inventory. So there's just this huge amount of stuff that these people who have an average FTE of 0 have to do every day. Next slide. So state emergency management agencies, the average number of FTEs just varies. I put widely, but I'd actually say wildly. So New York State might have, 300 people. Virginia, for example, I believe is funded to 160 people. And here in Massachusetts, we have 90 FTEs. Rhode Island has fewer than that. New Hampshire has fewer than that. So the number of FTEs from state to state is just going to vary depending on their funding. Funding also correlates directly with how many disasters they have. So as you can imagine, Florida has a much larger emergency management agency than Massachusetts because there's a lot more disasters that then result in emergency management just being more salient to our politicians and leadership. Who fills the role? Here's where we really get into our subject matter expertise. So we have at the state level experts in mitigation, we have experts in recovery, experts in planning. And so we move from the generalist to the subject matter expertise in training, exercise, et cetera. Our workload doesn't get lighter. So our agencies, while they might be larger than the local level, the workload is not a lot better. So for example, our planning unit here at MEMA currently has 4 planners. We have, I think, 1 or 2 positions still open. So we're working off 4 planners with 57 state emergency plans that they have to review and update on a 5-year cycle. In addition to that, they have different events that come up every year. We have 4th of July coming up. We have a US Open, and then every year we have the Boston Marathon. And they have to do their work to fulfill their roles with the State Emergency Operations Center. And again, that is 4 people with 57 plans plus all of this other work. So the workload is not lighter. Our recovery unit has a total of 4 people as well, and are currently trying to manage COVID reimbursements for the largest disaster this country's ever seen. And so because of that, we have to bring in vendors. States have a slightly different kind of mission. I call it a dual mission. The states work on and coordinate the state level response. So what is the state, how is the state responding to a disaster or preparing for disaster? But we also look towards the locality, the local level, and we support them as our constituents. How can we support their planning? How we support their response? We support training, exercise, et cetera. So every state EMA is kind of looking in 2 directions for their mission. Next slide. Money. Everybody loves to talk about money. So the graph that you see in front of you actually comes from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. This was in their 2019 annual report. What I wanted to start it with was actually the local level funding. Going back to our state EM needs assessment that was published in the fall, the second really alarming thing that jumped out at me when I read it was that the average annual budget for a local emergency management agency from all sources is $5,000 a year. So again, imagine an EMD who gets $5,000 a year as their operational budget being asked to do more and support more with $5,000 a year. The chart that you see has much bigger numbers. It looks huge at the state level, but if you can see it, there's a red line there because these numbers all include what's called pass-through funding. A large portion of state emergency management funds are passed directly through to the localities. So what a state's emergency management budget actually is down there on that green line. So it's much smaller than what you might see cycle through officially as part of the budget. But that downward slant there is very real and it continues. In fact, even through COVID, when we got CARES Act, we being the government, got CARES Act and ARPA funds, a lot of those funds, depending on the state that you're in, did not go to emergency management. They went to public health or cabinet level things. Some of it may have made it to emergency management. Every state handled it a little bit differently. But it's important to understand that even at the state level, those budgets are fairly small. In Massachusetts, the MEMA budget is actually by comparison, it's 1% of the Massachusetts State Police budget by comparison. Next slide. I've heard numerous times in different conversations of, well, we could just have the state do this big survey analysis. Which slide are we on right now?
Grant programs.
Grant programs. Okay, I saw it flip. I apologize. But it's very important to understand that, let's say a locality gets EMPG funds, that's Emergency Management Preparedness Grant. A locality may get anywhere from $0 all the way up to, in Massachusetts, I think the highest is $75,000. The state gets some grant funding as well. And the amounts can range again anywhere from $5,000 to a couple $100,000. But it's important to understand that those costs are also very high. At MEMA, we recently put out an RFR, request for responses, to just install a handrail on a ramp. The lowest bid that we got back was $28,000. And that's not even for materials. It was just for installation. Another good example is we hired a vendor to do a recovery plan for the state. The recovery plan cost $160,000. So those grant funds, even at the state level, are very quickly eaten up. Stephen, did you want to talk at all about the amounts and kind of the cost that you guys see from grants at the
Sure.
local level?
Sure. So some states have set up different disaster preparedness funds. After Hurricane Andrew in Florida, the fantastic minds of early emergency management actually came up with a plan to create an emergency management trust fund, because they saw a lot of the challenges that local emergency managers were having managing some of the costs that were incurred by setting up an emergency management program. What that trust fund did was levied a $2 charge on every renter's and insurance and homeowner's insurance policy, where that cost is collected and then divided equally amongst the 67 counties. In addition, the state of Florida does receive the EMPG grant dollars that come from the federal government, the Emergency Management Performance Grant, which is a federal allocation, which Don was mentioning is a pass-through fund, which many states do send dollars down to the locals. In Florida, we do that based on a calculation of our population. In Florida, some of the communities, especially some of the counties that want to build out to have more than just that 0 FTE, pay their staff completely out of those grant funds. So the operational costs that would come into play for those individuals that receive the grants, the dollars are eaten up by personnel costs. In other counties, like ours, in Seminole County, the Board of County Commissioners actually takes on our salaries as a general fund expenditure and allows us to use the grant funds for operational costs like community-wide alerting systems, shelter studies, community information and collaboration building, planning, exercises, trainings, things like that. And often it eats up quite a bit of our operational expenditures. So the emergency management offices in Florida generally have about $100,000 as operating budgets for the entire year, assuming that they are not being eaten up by salaries. What's important too is that these grant funds, if they're used for salaries or operational costs, not everything is allowable on these grants. We're met with a lot of restrictions. So much like Dawn was saying about installing a handrail for accessibility, prior to the installation of that handrail, especially during using certain grant fund programs, an environmental and historical preservation report needs to be done on that structure, because you are permanently affixing an item to a building. That includes things like validating that the building that you're putting that on is not a historical building, making sure that bird migration patterns don't implicate the handrail, making sure that you're not disrupting any special types of soils. While that may sound unusual and frivolous, this is part of the grant process and the red tape of the grant that has required us to fill out these EHP documents and get them submitted through the chain to FEMA. In some cases, that takes 6 to 8 months for those approvals to come back before an individual is even allowed to spend, if they have that $28,000 on that handrail. Many of you are probably asking, well, why do we have to go through these vendors? Why can't we use volunteer organizations to help with that? We can, but in certain cases, the government agencies and some of the federal requirements prohibit us from using individuals that may not be certified vendors to come on government property to do those types of enhancements. It's so important at a local level with this finite amount of dollars that we really build partnerships within our community to meet the needs of those small dollars and make sure that volunteer organizations, community organizations, and local emergency managers are thinking outside the box on some of these solutions to meet the needs of those concerns that you may have for accessibility and inclusion.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I wanted to address real quick the match piece that's up there as well. All federal grants come with a required match. Almost all of them are a 25% match. There is one mitigation program I'm aware of that's a 10% match. So what that means is, like, MEMA is looking at reevaluating how we distribute EMPG funds and how do we do it more equitably. But if you increase, let's say a smaller town or city typically gets to a $2,000 grant, they have to match 25% of those costs. If all of a sudden you say, hey, here's a $100,000 grant, they now have to 25% match the $100,000, and they may not be able to do that. There are ways to do matches using volunteer hours, et cetera, but consider that when you're having conversation with folks about, well, could you apply for additional federal money, or could we consider giving them more money? That there's a balancing act there that is going to have to go with that. If you're in a voluntary agency, a nonprofit, consider if your work might be able to help a locality meet that match, because that's a really good selling point. Hey, bring us onto your team. Any work we do as a nonprofit or a volunteer agency might apply to your match. And as Stephen said, there's all kinds of requirements and restrictions. There's allowable expenses. So just because we have, let's say, hazardous materials emergency preparedness grant, that has a pretty restricted list of things that we can spend money on, and we can't change it. And it's not real arguable. It's just here's the list of stuff you can do with this particular grant. And then the typical use that we see at the local level, in addition to salaries, a lot of times this is how they maintain or purchase new equipment. We have a couple of localities that have invested 100% of their grant funds just into their IT infrastructure, because it's the only way they can get a new laptop when the last one burned out. And so when you're talking to a local EMD, or if you are a local EMD and you want to talk to them about money or something that costs money, keep this piece of it in mind. Next slide. Local EMD salaries. So I got to pay homage there to Director Sam Phillips. This is a picture of her when she was out as the director of the city of Philadelphia. She is my immediate predecessor here at MEMA, the best MEMA. So I wanted to use her as our local EM image. But it's important to know that with local EMD salaries, there's a pretty significant difference between small, medium, and large emergency management agencies. Stephen, did you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so what we find throughout Florida specifically, a lot of it is based on the amount of individuals in the community, amount of citizens that you have. In some of our rural areas, you'll see salaries, especially in the panhandle and the middle of the state of Florida, range anywhere, an emergency management director, from $35,000 to $45,000. In more of the mid-range communities, you'll see emergency management director salary be anywhere from $45,000 to $60,000. And then in the large urbanized areas like your Jacksonvilles, your Orlandos, Miamis, et cetera, those larger communities, you'll see anywhere between $80,000 and $120,000. Now, keep in mind that this is directed specifically at how much money is allocated to the emergency management program. In some cases, the staff's salaries are either complemented by grant funds or entirely covered by the grant allocation that they receive, or the local jurisdiction accepts that through their general fund budget. What also is interesting is what we see in different states, and what I've learned talking to many different colleagues across the country is that in Florida specifically, you actually make more money working for the locals than you do at the state level, which is so vitally important. Our state partners at the Florida Division of Emergency Management work so hard to support the local communities, and it's often that they end up coming down to work at the local level because the salaries are just not sustainable at the state level. I know that's not the same in every state across the country, where getting a state position from a local position is actually an upgrade in terms of dollars. But the impact that the locals and the state emergency management makes on working together in the state of Florida is so important. And, you know, we really try and put salaries aside. I'm 5th generation government employee and 5th generation public safety individual. And if my family was looking to get rich in government, it's just, we don't do it for the money. We do it for the mission, and we do it for protecting our communities and making sure that they have the resources that they need, especially during times of emergency.
In Virginia, at the local level, you know, we have the same as most other states, where a vast majority of our local EMs are fire chiefs. But in Virginia, a lot of the towns then had some of the larger cities and counties then had an emergency management like deputy director who really did the bulk of the work. The salaries there in Virginia were pretty solid. Again, if you're a fire chief, you're just getting paid to be the fire chief. But even those deputy coordinators, they call them in Virginia, are still doing pretty well. But that, again, as Stephen said, varies state to state. In Massachusetts, we have some small cities and towns who have volunteer emergency management directors, or they have part-time who work on a stipend. I spoke with one local EMD who said his stipend is $1,000, and that's what he works from. So the reason we wanted to just share this particular reality with you is when you're talking to someone in Florida who's, you know, making more than the state EMAs, you're not going to hit as much resistance based on asking them to allocate more time to something. Whereas if you're talking to somebody in Massachusetts who's a volunteer EM or working on a $1,000 stipend, there just might be a little bit more resistance to adding to their duties, or what they see is adding to their duties. And you need to acknowledge that in your conversations and before your approach, so that you communicate your respect for what they're doing in the situation that they're in. Next slide. Leadership and political will. So this might seem like kind of a weird topic to stick in here, but it's actually really, really important to understand. And we're going to start with leadership. So next slide. We've talked a few times about at the local level, our immediate director level leadership is you know, a fire chief, a police chief, and an emergency management director. But when we talk about our leaders, it's important to understand the impact that they will have on the success or failure of efforts to increase accessibility. Because when your leadership disagrees with changes that you want to make as an emergency manager, or doesn't understand the importance, then getting anywhere can be really challenging. Stephen?
Yeah, so it's also very unique in different communities where emergency management sits. So in some cases, like Dawn mentioned, it could be that it's a division of a fire department, or it could be a division of a sheriff's office. What we've found historically is those emergency management offices that have direct line of communication to a county administrator or report directly to an elected body tend to get heard a little bit more. And that doesn't discredit, again, the individuals that are in those divisions, or, you know, it really depends on what kind of relationship you have with those leaders in your community or the elected officials in your community, to champion a lot of these causes that we may have. And also keep in mind, accessibility and integration is so important in all of the things that we do. But in addition, there is a myriad of other political pressured items that are being hit by these individuals in leadership that they have to prioritize. And us in emergency management have to make sure that we are empathetic of that widespread of themes and issues that are being brought to their attention as leaders, and have to figure out when the right time is to bring up our issue. So that it is heard and it is dedicated the right amount of time and attention and dollars towards some of those items. So it's so important in emergency management that we have good relationships with our leaders. And that's one of the ways that the other organizations can help us too. Because sometimes a message on accessibility and integration falls on deaf ears when it comes internal, and we need the nonprofit and faith-based community and those community organizations that are huge advocates for accessibility integration to really take some time to spend with our leadership so they can hear it from the outside as well. That only aids to the overall mission of us achieving true accessibility in disaster response. And having that communication from the outside and internally really lends credit to the mission that we all have.
And finally, around leadership, it's important to understand that emergency management, no matter where it is, what state, what locality, where it is within a political jurisdiction's org chart, fire department, independent emergency management, it's public safety. And in public safety, particularly among leadership, the mantra is you do the most for the most. So if you're going into a fire, you help the most people that you can, and you make decisions on who is going to be, what decision is going to save the most people. When you bring that into emergency management as a leader, or even, when you're just getting started, that's what leads us to putting 90% of our time and effort into the general population versus these underserved, marginalized populations that need a more equitable response or a more accessible response. Stephen, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so what's interesting is when you do the most for the most, what we end up finding is that there is actually an amount of acceptable loss. I once attended a presentation with some individuals who tried to better define what the term acceptable losses were. And what bothered me through the presentation is that our job in public safety is, yes, to do the most for the most, but also recognize that there's no such thing as acceptable losses anymore. Those days are over. And it's those individuals that have been left behind for decades that are truly in need of the message of preparedness, of the message of community organizations, and bringing together those individuals, for the overall mission. We're often asked in emergency management to go and talk to different community organizations on community preparedness. And what I question all the time is, are the people who are asking us to come truly the ones that need to hear the message? or we have a duty in emergency management in addition to our daily jobs to seek out those individuals that we already know that are vulnerable, that are going to be part of that acceptable loss group, to make sure that they are no longer part of those losses. So doing the most for the most historically has been something that emergency management professionals and public safety professionals have across the country have, worked on. But personally, as a planner and much of the new emergency management professionals coming through, see that accessibility and inclusion plays a key role in all of our planning efforts. And acceptable losses are no longer acceptable.
Just to round out that discussion, thank you, Stephen. The perspective I would love to see in emergency management, the perspective shift, is instead of putting 90% of our time and effort into planning, preparing for, responding to the general population, is that we flip that script and we focus the majority of our effort and our planning and our preparedness on those who really, really need the support. So like me or Stephen or some of the other folks on this call, if there's an evacuation, we don't need any help understanding messages. We don't need help evacuating. We're just going to get in our car and we're going to go. I am not who you need to spend your time on. The people who need interpreters, who need things translated, who need evacuation support and accessibility at shelters, that's where we ought to be spending our time. And so just a little, podium speech there on this is the shift that we really need in our public safety mantra. Next slide. Political will. As emergency managers, actually in a previous conversation Stephen and I had, he said, in emergency management, we don't want our work to be political, but it's going to involve politicians, and for all of the reasons we're about to walk through. The first one is buzzwords and key phrases. Politicians love buzzwords and key phrases. They will latch on to them, and then they'll work really hard at taking advantage of those buzzwords and key phrases. How that applies to us in inclusive and accessible emergency management is that we need to take advantage of that when it occurs. So right now, there's a lot of focus on equity, which is a brand new conversation for emergency management. The conversations around accessibility really need to say, part of equity is accessibility. So as you're talking about passing this FEMA equity bill that's been introduced in the Senate, make sure that we're including accessibility and people with disabilities in those conversations. Hey, local mayor, if you want to work on equity, think about this. Stephen, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so one of the things I tell, and I go up to Tallahassee at the state level and lobby for emergency management issues on an annual basis. I also have a very good relationship with our local contingent of politicians and our community leaders. And one of the best things that I tell new emergency managers is don't ever let a disaster go to waste. Don't ever let a disaster in your community or emergency go to, don't ever let it pass by inviting politicians to actually see boots on the ground what you're doing. A politician's number one job is to get reelected. Not saying that you're going to be the one that gets them reelected, but take a moment to help them understand the individuals that are in their community. I want to tell a quick story about Hurricane Irma that impacted our community. Prior to Hurricane Irma, I was approached by a home health agency who provides service for the largest contingent of children who are on ventilators and trachs in the state of Florida. They happen to live in residential homes in my community. They came to me and said, the last disaster, the Children's Hospital said that they were not welcome there anymore because of the medical burden that it put on the hospital and the strain that it put on the community medical system. We worked together to partner with state agencies and federal assets to make sure that those individuals had a safe place to go during a disaster. What they ended up doing was pretty much setting up an ICU in one of our local elementary schools, that we had backup generators and power involved to make sure that those individuals were safe on their life-sustaining medical devices. What was great about this too is it allowed agency officials and local politicians the ability to see the conditions of some of these children and some of the great work on accessibility that we're providing at the local level if we all work together to build a better place for these individuals to go when it's safe. So we did. We walked some of our local politicians through the shelter so they could see some of the individuals that were in the shelter and how complex sheltering actually is. It opened up their eyes and became something that they remember as part of their career as a politician, as a shining moment where the community truly pulled together and did good. In these cases, it's so important to keep those relationships going, because you never know what kind of lobbying organization is going to put unusual legislation on the table, when your field might be under attack legislatively, when funding might be stripped or increased or pulled to a different scenario. So it's so important that we in emergency management, and you all as accessibility and inclusion advocates, play a strong role in getting to know the politicians and community leaders in your community, so we can have the resources we need to do good during disasters.
Thanks, Stephen. For the other part of the political will piece is, if you weren't aware, it's politicians who set our budgets and our FTE caps. And that's really important, because you could have an administration, whether it's state or local, today that is really supportive, understands EM, thinks it's important, but your next administration may really just view it as a check in the box or an insurance policy. So particularly at the local level, you could have one administration wants the local EMD to be an independent agency staffed. The very next mayor says, well, no, let's just move it under fire again. And they don't need any full-time staff. So our politicians play really a profound role in how successful we can be as emergency managers, but also the resources and support that we have for inclusive emergency management. That's where the legislation piece comes in, is that, for example, the state of Washington really wanted an access and functional needs position. They lobbied for it, worked with their politicians, and they either just passed or are currently working to pass legislation that makes a permanent, that requires an access and functional needs position for emergency management. And and that is very likely probably the best way to get some of these AFN accessibility equity things done. I mentioned earlier the FEMA equity bill that Senator Elizabeth Warren has introduced in the Senate, which really works to make some permanent and specific change to how FEMA does equity. So politicians, even if they're not our favorite people to work with, and we kind of like go, politics, it's still a really important piece of what we do. Next slide. And I apologize, I left a word off this slide. So control and accountability. EMDs are ultimately held responsible for the outcomes of response and recovery, and it really doesn't matter who made what decision. I actually worked for a director who, every time there was an activation of the Emergency Operations Center, drafted a resignation and had it on his desk, because emergency managers are the ones that their head is on the chopping block if things don't go well. It leads to a fear of not controlling everything, and not wanting to let community-based organizations just take that ball and run with it. So we need to understand that this happens. We allow our trusted partners, public utilities, schools, public health, to take their pieces and go forward and do great things with their pieces. But when you're talking about organizations and agencies you're not familiar with, understand that the EMD is ultimately going to be held to account for what happens during a response. And so that may lead to some fear and some resistance around including community-based organizations. Next slide. Stephen?
Yeah, so during response, I'll go briefly about what we generally do in emergency management. ESFs, or emergency support functions, are very focused on their tasks that they do in the operations center. Basically, it's how emergency management organizes chaos locally. They also have emergency support functions at the state and federal levels, and allows people to stay in their lane and make sure that their work tasks are very focused, and that they are making sure that they're not running over into somebody else's role. So for example, transportation is a very busy emergency support function. In Florida, it's not just worrying about our transportation systems, but locally, our emergency support function for transportation is actually moving individuals that are medically vulnerable to special needs or medically enhanced shelters. As you can imagine, in the first few days of emergency operation, things are insane. There's sticky notes everywhere. There's people typing feverishly into computers, moving assets around the community, providing public information, answering citizen concerns, transporting individuals to shelters, picking up individuals, helping individuals evacuate, calling for evacuations, curfews, worrying about our business community, making sure that the call centers in our community are staffed, and you name it. So the workload on an emergency manager who FTE is 0 has to organize and conduct all of this insanity that's now happening, and all these calls for service and work tasks that are coming in throughout the community. Again, the mantra of do the most for the most, that continues to be something that is a guiding principle in some cases, but we're seeing a major shift in that acceptable losses are no longer acceptable. And we try to make sure that our plans and procedures that we follow are not leaving anybody behind, regardless of their medical capability or their socioeconomic class or anything like that. We actually have certain plans in place locally to better serve those individuals. And then command and general staff focuses on some of the leadership in the Emergency Operations Center. We have several positions that actually command the room, and then the general staff work in certain functions to make sure that things are getting paid, that we're able to procure certain items, that we're making progress on the incident, and that there's people looking ahead to see where we're going in the disaster response and recovery phase.
Great, next slide.
Mm-hmm.
All right, this is what I want you to take away from this. Like, if you don't remember anything else, this is it. Don't fight forces, use them. What we've talked to you about, 1, we're not making it up. 2, these are immovable obstacles. So we have to figure out how to use these to make our programs more inclusive, or to make our pitches and our advocacy for accessibility more successful. Next slide. So you're going to need to adapt your approach using the realities and the information that we shared with you today. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these. We've given some suggestions as we went through, but this is really what we want kind of to lump all those into these categories. Demonstrate your understanding, understand the money piece, staffing or vendors, build trust, and bring solutions. Next slide. Stephen?
So like we said, demonstrating your understanding, having that understanding of the pressures that the profession's up against, having the understanding of where the emergency management office or staff falls in the community in terms of where they're organized, and understanding the scope of the responsibilities that they have, not only during emergencies, but during blue skies as well. Understanding of the situation in the community is disasters change. They are continuing to become more complex and they're becoming more frequent. And if you empathize with an emergency manager who, again, FTE of 0, who is in a constant disaster cycle and in a constant response mode, it's very hard to tap an emergency manager on the shoulder who's going a million miles a minute to try to meet the needs of the community and say, I need to talk to you about the accessibility and inclusion in this phase of a disaster. So knowing when the right time is to bring that conversation forward and making sure that you get their undivided attention on this critical issue in how complex the disasters are is so important. And then demonstrating your understanding of their challenges. These challenges that we face in emergency management that are so unknown. We are not going to know what the challenges the next disaster is going to bring to our community. It may not even have to deal with our own community. We may be receiving or feeling the impacts of nearby communities and the challenges that they're experiencing and have to help other people. So if you come into a conversation about accessibility and inclusion already having an understanding and being empathetic to the emergency manager and coming to them with solutions, which Dawn's going to talk about, is so important in getting into the door and making sure that you're heard.
Next slide. All right, so money. Keep in mind that budgets are small, costs are huge. And so when you're advocating or working on this as an EM and you're approaching a local or state EMD, think about how you can help them find money or meet their match. And then keep in mind that these projects with a staff of 0 or overtasked state emergency management staff, how can you help them with project management, or how can you help them as a vendor? Because you get the money, you do the project, but you still have to have the time and the bandwidth to do the work itself. So what can you do as a disability advocate or service organization or agency to help with the money to match or the project management? Next slide. Stephen?
So one of the biggest things that you can do as well is build a sense of trust. I don't think that there's anything more important in emergency management than the relationships we have with our community members and our community organizations and our partners that help us during disasters. You'll see the circle of trust and all the different personality traits that are circled around here. And we tried to bullet point it out towards the bottom. So demonstrating that you have an expertise in your area is going to help the emergency manager trust you as a subject matter expert. I always say that emergency managers need to be 1 inch deep in knowledge, but miles wide. We need to know a little bit about a lot of things. We are not the experts when it comes to COVID. We are not the experts when it comes to hurricanes. We rely on our meteorologists, on our epidemiologists, on our medical directors to guide us in whatever disaster is occurring. And if you demonstrate yourself as an expert in this area, it's only going to lend to that trust atmosphere. You always want to advise an emergency manager what they're doing that might have an opportunity for enhancement, but never come at an emergency manager as an attack. In the end, we're all here for the same purpose, to protect the community. Everybody has their interests and everybody has ways in which they want to see that protection occur. So advising the emergency manager on good practices based on your expertise is very important. Never let the emergency manager be hit by a bus, or never run over the emergency manager with a metaphorical bus. That is a surefire way to never be in the circle of trust. Emergency manager does not like to be blindsided by issues, and always approach the emergency management team or the emergency manager with a sense of inclusion and respect for all the stuff that they're up against. And
Stephen,
when in doubt, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I have been in a meeting before, and when we say, never even imply that you are going to throw an EM under the bus. That's like you said, walls up. I've been in a meeting before where a disability advocate pulled out a pad of paper and a pen and started writing down names and said, I am writing down the names of everyone in this room I'm going to sue. And this was an access and functional needs planning group. So right there, that person was never going to be included in that group again as an effective member, because if we as emergency managers, what's human nature? If we think someone is going to throw us under a bus or they're threatening us, which is the attacking, we don't want to work with that person. And that's just never going to be effective, no matter how frustrated you are. So it's always a good approach to ask questions and say, hey, I noticed that your shelter that have you ever been out there and seen if the showers are actually available? Did you know that most high schools don't use their showers as storage? And just ask questions. That's just such an easier approach to take. It's non-combative, it's non-accusatory. It comes from a place of curiosity and wanting to help. Next slide. Bring solutions. So we have heard the what. We need to make our programs accessible, and we need to make them equitable. Please don't stop there. We need some help with the how. What do we need to do is very clear. How we do it, not always. We are not disability experts. What we need is the bridge between what and how. So if you think about the workload or how busy they are in an EOC during a response, what solution can you bring to them? Can you bring them resources? Can you be the person in their EOC that is helping with the access and functional needs and the accessibility of that? Can you join them in their planning groups and help advise? Can you connect them with other people who are resources? So think about teaching emergency managers how to make their program accessible and bringing them the solutions to do it, instead of just going, we need you to do more, we need you to do better. Tell us how, and then help us do it. Stephen, did you want to add anything?
There's so many ways, emergency managers are hit with all kinds of problems every day. And what's important is that it's great to present a problem, but presenting multiple solutions to that problem is also important. One of the ways that we utilize individuals that we're trying to serve better is incorporate them into the planning process. Bring those individuals that you want to make sure aren't left behind. bring them to the table when you're writing plans and procedures to make sure that you truly are writing something and developing a procedure that's accessible. I can't tell you how many times we've had a shelter team go into a shelter and have individuals who are in wheelchairs unable to move throughout the shelter effectively. And bring those individuals that you're trying to reach in that planning process prior to even opening that shelter or opening up that incident site to make sure that it is truly accessible. Because again, in our mind as emergency managers, we only see things the way we see them. We may not see them through the eyes of other individuals.
Next slide. All right, so we have an online community. It's called the Inclusive Emergency Management Community. The community brings folks together, anyone who is working in or interested in inclusive emergency management, which we define to include accessibility, access functional needs, and equity as well. So it brings us together and provides a place for us to access diverse connections, knowledge, experiences, and ideas that help us expand the inclusive emergency management movement and work smarter, more efficiently, and with less friction in our own roles. So the community works together to collaborate on challenges that don't have an easy or obvious answer, translate what we need to do into how we actually do it, increase the prevalence of inclusive emergency management practices, and work together on this larger purpose while finding ways to improve and expand our own work in inclusive emergency management in our own unique spheres. Next slide. This community is totally free and open. There aren't restrictions on who can be on. It does not cost anything. You are invited to join. It has a variety of stuff that we do, of course, connecting people, resource sharing, polls, articles, webinars, groups, but we also do some real world work. Like right now, we're developing AFN EOC position guidance and templates. So if you'd like to check it out, it's inclusiveem.community. And again, it is completely free and it is open to anyone who would like to join. Next slide. And that is a wrap for us. I believe Stephen is going to put his contact information in the chat. This is mine. Please feel free to reach out if you would like to do some follow-up with us as well. We'll turn it back over to Lewis.
All right, thank you so much, Dawn and Stephen. That was a very nice presentation, and sometimes alarming, sometimes helpful. So that's great. I wanted to, for all the attendees, now is the time for you to ask your questions in the chat room, and we will get to those in a moment. I wanted to piggyback on your presentation and talk about a couple of solutions that I think people should know about and will know about, if not sooner rather than later. And that is that each jurisdiction has a responsibility under the ADA to have what's known as an ADA coordinator. In our research on emergency managers in Region 9, we found that only 36% of the emergency managers even knew that they had an ADA coordinator in their jurisdiction. So this is a big gap, and those are the people who will be able to provide a lot of the resources and knowledge that you both were raising as potential problems for the emergency managers to try to know, because they have so much that they need to know how to be an expert about all this. There is supposed to be, now it's not saying there is, but there is supposed to be an ADA coordinator in every jurisdiction. So that might be another thing for everyone to understand as well. Given that, let's move on to some questions, and we have a lot of comments, and hopefully we'll get some questions at the end. Although there is one question at the beginning that I don't know if it's related, and so let me ask it and see if you guys know. Massachusetts has an app called Show Me for Emergencies. which assists persons with disabilities during emergencies. Are other states or private vendors able to use it to create their own apps for alerting?
I believe I can take that one since it's Massachusetts. And actually, I've only been here 2.5 years. I have never heard of this app. I know we have some other team members. Jackie's been here with us for more than 10 years. I don't know if she can type in the chat if she is familiar with this app at all. So we clearly at MEMA don't use it, but what I can do is check into it. I don't know who has developed it, so the API doesn't live with MEMA. We can track it down and then try to work through Lewis to send it out. If we can track, again, if we can track it down.
Okay, great, thanks. Next one, and here's a series of comments. We'll just sort of go through them. I've encountered clerks, town admins, communication, marketing staff to serve roles as an emergency manager where there is no designated emergency manager staff at the local level. So this spoke to your comment earlier on of having different kinds of roles that people needed to participate in. There was another comment, the special fund from Florida should be presented at the IAM-EM conference. Everyone needs to know about this. So that was a note for you guys. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down the list. As an emergency manager with a disability from the state of Montana, I would back what Dawn and Stephen have said. Very well put. It's difficult to approach with doing this with EMs, but doable. So I think this is basically about your approach comments. And people wanted you to provide the website name again, Dawn. So if you could, maybe you can type that into the chat.
Sure, it's actually up on the screen right now at the bottom.
Ah, there it is. Okay. Okay, and Dawn's contact information is in the chat. Okay, here's another comment for you. This is great info. During COVID, we in Michigan had a heck of a time finding resources, excuse me, specifically ways to close, caption, and subtitle live video feeds. Any global resources to share?
So we have to go through a state contract. So I don't know about global resources. We have, I think, 4 or 5 captioning contracts that we can pull from. And I know that rev.com links with Zoom for live captioning and says that they meet the 98% correct requirement or recommendation. But other than that, for captioning and subtitling live video feeds, on the inclusive EM community, we always use rev.com on ours, and it seems to have gone pretty well. Other than that, I don't know of any global resources that don't require contracts with a vendor. Stephen?
Yeah, we were, when we looked at the social vulnerability index in our community and some of the major demographics in our community in terms of language, we really catered to those individuals that had those language barriers. And actually, we did have state and local contracts set up ahead of time, but we really relied heavily on leaders within those communities to get messages out that we wanted. It didn't cost us anything but the partnership, and we're better off as an emergency management agency today by having those partnerships, not just for COVID, but now during hurricanes and other types of disasters, that we were meeting these individuals on the fly that had the connections with those individuals in the community already. So, I challenge emergency managers all the time to get out from behind their desk and get into their community and start to learn who truly is in their community if they have time to do it. And if they do, find out who those leaders are that can help get their message out.
And Lewis, just real quick, I know the next one up is the link to this Show Me booklet. I have seen this booklet. North Carolina uses this book as well. And DPH, Department of Public Health, has told us if people want to download it and then use it themselves, that can be done free of charge. It's just if you want us to print them for you and mail them, then there's a charge. But I'm still not aware of necessarily an app, but you are allowed to use Show Me, the communication tool, if you would like.
Right, and I just put that into the chat for everyone. So if you would like to go to that link, you can at your leisure. Next question. I currently work at a university as an emergency manager. How do you envision state, local feds collaborating with universities and colleges in the future? More and more schools are developing their own EM offices.
Stephen, do you want to start?
Yeah, so just in my community alone, I work with 3, not only university, but school system emergency managers. Many of you are familiar with the Stoneman Douglas shooting that happened in Florida on Valentine's Day a couple of years ago. And that sparked a whole slew of different legislative priorities that included establishing school safety officials, and in some cases, offices of emergency management for public schools and universities throughout the country. What we see with them is force multipliers in our community to get that preparedness messaging out, utilizing the resources that are on campus for the community at large. A lot of times during disasters, especially in Florida, campuses are closed. That doesn't mean that the resources stop. So we utilize the tools that we all have in our community, especially in the university system, more particularly with accessibility and inclusion tools, to leverage some of that assistance during an emergency. So I love partnering with our university system. They have a completely different outlook on grant programs and resources, and they have a little less restriction in what they can use their dollars for. And the more we partner together, the stronger we are as a community.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. There's only one more comment. I have been putting a lot of the resources that people have been putting into the chat that we could see into the public chat. So a lot of those have to do with captions and idea that upcoming is the Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So you should avail yourself of those resources. And then one last comment before we go. We need a class for EMs to learn how to work with other EMs or staff who have disabilities, especially to learn about equal opportunity for those individuals and their required accommodations.
Lewis, hey, I just wanted to jump in on that one. I couldn't agree more. One of the future features of the community is developing online courses. So whoever wrote that would love to chat about developing that kind of a course that people can do asynchronously or synchronously in the future, because we have a free platform where we can provide that.
All right. All right, we realize that many of you may still have questions for our speakers, and apologize if you didn't get a chance to ask your question. You have Dawn's contact there. I put Stephen's in the general chat for you. And if your question revolves around the Americans with Disabilities Act and issues around that, you can contact your regional ADA center at 1-800-949-4232. If you will also receive an email with a link to an online session evaluation, please complete the evaluation for today's program, as we really value your input and want to demonstrate the importance of this to our funder. We want to thank Dawn and Stephen today for sharing their time and knowledge with us. It's a great presentation. And a reminder again that the session was recorded and it will be available next week at adapresentations.org in the archive section of the emergency management area. Our next webinar will be held on June 9th. Please watch your email 2 weeks ahead of time for the announcement of the opening of the registration for that webinar. And we thank you for attending today. And once again, thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Stephen. And
Thanks, Louis.
have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.